would like to introduce today Dean Buonomano. He is a computational neuroscientist from UCLA, and today he will talk about his book, Your Brain is a Time Machine, which you can actually buy with a discounted price at this table. And without further ado, welcome, Dean.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to talk a bit about time and the brain and the nature of time. And to get my talk started, I'd like to start by creating a awkward silence. And I'd like to do that to make 3 points. The first is that your brain is automatically attempting to predict what is about to happen. Your brain is a prediction machine. So right there, you were trying to predict what was about to happen. Maybe you're thinking, uh-oh, he's having an absence seizure. Number 2, your brain is automatically telling time. The only reason you could notice that pause is because you're creating a temporal expectation of the normal average pause between words, and that temporal pause was violated, and that's when the passage of time came to your attention. And that's my point number 3. You probably became aware of the passage of time. The subjective feeling of time going slowly, because it was a slightly awkward moment, and time probably seemed to be going slowly, and hopefully it wasn't as long as it seemed to be. At least I hope it wasn't, because to me it seemed like a full minute. But before we delve into the mechanisms of how the brain tells time and the meaning of the nature of time, let me already start off by pointing out that I've used the word time a number of times in this talk already, and I assume you know what I mean, and you assume I know what the word means. But is that the case? Can we actually define time? It turns out, I'm sorry, here, let me get used to clicking this. It turns out that the word time is the most common noun in the English language, along with 2 others that are units of time, year and day. So this is an obvious indication of how important time is in our lives. But it's a bit ironic that the most common noun in the English language is one that we really can't define. It's a bit embarrassing, actually, isn't it? So this brings us to the problem, how do we define time? And people have struggled with this for a long, long time. So 1,600 years ago, St. Augustine said, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know." 1,600 years later, the great physicist Richard Feynman, who's not one to give up easily on problems, basically gave up and said, maybe it's just as well we face the fact that time is one of those things we probably cannot define. What matters anyways is not how we define time, but how we measure it. But it was probably the author Douglas Adams that gave us the most important definition of time. Time is an illusion, lunchtime doubly so. So part of the problem is that the word time really means different things, right? And let me give you this rather contrived sentence to make that point. Einstein's talk on the nature of time started on time but seemed to last a long time. Okay, so first, the nature of time. So that refers to the physics of time. Is time a full-blown dimension, as in the 4 dimensions of time, as only the present exist? Is time an abstraction that we scientists use to help us understand the universe? Second, started on time. That's clock time. That's the easiest time to define, right? That's time is defined as what clocks tell. As circular as that definition is, it's a really useful one and probably the most important in that it got all of us here on time. The last one is the subjective feeling of time. So it seemed to last a long time. And that's tightly linked to the problem of consciousness. So in that sense, the subjective sense of time is also a very difficult problem to address. Now, starting with the first question, the brain is, time is really important how the brain works. So, and this is why I consider, in many ways, the brain to be, if you will, a time machine. And there's 4 reasons for that. The brain is a machine that tells time. The brain generates the subjective feeling of the passage of time. The brain attempts to predict the future. The brain remembers the past in order to predict the future. And finally, the brain allows us to project ourselves, mentally project ourselves into the past or the future, something we call mental time travel. And this is really important for our ability to interact with the world in terms of what makes humans unique is our ability to engage in mental time travel. And we'll talk a bit more about this. But first, consider the first issue here. The brain is a time machine. So the brain tells time across 12 orders of magnitude, from microseconds at the lower end over there to down here, which you're using right now for sound localization. So your brain picks up the tens or hundreds of microseconds delays. It takes sound to arrive from my left ear to my right ear by picking up the delta t's, the relative time delays there. Time perception in speech is on the order of hundreds of milliseconds and seconds. Music, motor coordination is happening on this range of time perception, and we'll delve more into that. And then we have time estimation, which is sort of what most people think of when we talk about their sense of time. How long has this talk been lasting? How long has the red light been waiting to change, and so forth. And finally, you have your circadian rhythms that everybody's familiar with in terms of controlling your clock, when to get up in the morning and when to go to bed. Now, so how does the brain tell time? So to answer that question, it's useful to think about timing in these different scales. So for example, in language, a couple of examples here are if I say something like, they gave her cat food, or they gave her cat food, right? So there you're using the pause in speech to determine the content of the meaning of the sentence. And by the way, this is something that artificial speech systems still struggle with a bit. This is one of the challenges and it's cause of some of the mistakes that are still made even with the most advanced systems. Now, another example here is in music. And now I'm going to play to you a piece of music. And the task here is it's a hybrid piece of music, and to see if it reminds you of anything. But the time has been altered. And I know some of you were here at the beginning, and you probably saw the next slide here, so you're going to have to keep quiet. But Google, please play music here. So does this remind you of any piece of music you know of? So I'll give you a hint. You guys are a young crowd, but it's from a group called the Beatles. Does it remind anybody? Does that ring a bell to anybody? Can anybody pick up what that was? Yep. Yellow Submarine. Okay, very good. Anything else? Anybody else remind you of any other song? So that's a hybrid song there. So what that was the notes. So you were paying more attention to the notes, the melody of Yellow Submarine, but it was the timing of yesterday. So we sort of did a hybrid crossing of the spatial information and the temporal information. So sometimes people pick up a bit more on the temporal structure, sometimes people pick up more on the melody. But this is just to make the obvious point that without time and ability to perceive and to tell time, music, of course, wouldn't exist. And indeed, it's in this scale of tens to hundreds of milliseconds that time is at most important. So in the context of the lab, for example, one question we ask is, whatever the mechanisms in your brain that allow you to tell time, can they improve with practice? So we often ask in studies where we do an interval discrimination studies to tell us, is the first or second interval the longest? Google, please play music. So there's a simple interval discrimination task, and the question is, was the first or second longest? And the first was 100 milliseconds, and the second interval was 150 milliseconds. Now, if you have some timer in your brain that's fixed, like a watch, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you can't get better at that. But if you practice and that timer improves, then you should be able to pick that up. And we do, and we can tell here that in the 100 millisecond case, that's what you just heard, people improve dramatically with practice. But interestingly, if you had a clock in your brain that was your master clock, you'd also get, and that clock was somehow improving, you should get better at all intervals. So you should also get better at the 50 millisecond interval, or the 200 millisecond interval, or the 500 millisecond. But you don't. So this is a bit strange, right? It's almost as if you have multiple clocks in your brain. You have an array of different clocks that can tell time across different time ranges. So how does the brain do that? Or where in the brain does the brain, what parts of the brain are responsible for timing? Fortunately, we know exactly what part of the brain tells time, and that's this part right here, right beside locality and music, conveniently located. This, of course, is nonsense. But this phrenological view of time, nevertheless, is surprisingly influential in how people think about time. So people do still think about time, even today, in the sense that you might have a central clock in your brain. So the office of this faculty is to mark the passage of time, duration, succession of events, etc. It also remembers dates, keeps correct time in music and dancing, and induces to punctuality in the fulfillment of engagement. So this is an extreme view of what you'd call a central clock, or a master clock in your brain. We know that this is not correct. The brain has multiple ways to tell time, has multiple areas in the brain that are involved in telling time. To understand how the brain tells time, let's first remind ourselves how man-made clocks actually work. So man-made clocks, despite their complexity, all work for the most part on an embarrassingly simple principle. And that's just an oscillator, your time base, and a counter. So whether you're talking about a pendulum clock or a quartz crystal or even an atomic clock in which you're using the period of the electromagnetic vibrations to tell time, you're just counting the ticks of an oscillator. So it's reasonable to ask, is that how the brain tells time? The answer is no. So as this quote from Einstein reminds us, any physical phenomena may be used as a clock, provided it can be exactly repeated as many times as desired. So here we have raindrops falling on a pond. And if I asked you which raindrop fell first, the up one over here or down here, you could tell me this raindrop fell first. And if we were so inclined and knew a bit of physics, we could even calculate the interval. So the point is that even this static image has information about time. And that's because physical systems that have dynamics naturally tell time. I mean, that's essentially what dynamics is. Dynamics is the change in time. So the idea is that the brain uses its own dynamics as one way to tell time. So neurons are the computational element of the brain. And neurons have their axons, they have their dendrites and their axons down here. The axons of one neuron can come over and synapse on the dendrites of another neuron. And that's where they make a synapse. It releases transmitter here and creates a bioelectrical signal that travels towards the soma of the postsynaptic neuron. So if you have these elements and they're connected to each other, one way we could make a timer or a clock, if you will, is to connect them in a chain. So if we had one neuron that was connected to another, connected to another, connected to another, connected to another, we can now see that we'll have this temporal pattern of activity in which one neuron activates the next, activates the next, activates the next. So you know that if this neuron is active, that 8 or 9, 10 units, time units have elapsed. So indeed, it seems that one way the brain tells time on the scale of tens to hundreds of milliseconds to seconds is through neural dynamics. And we know this in part due to research on a number of studies on both humans and animals. And one animal that knows how to time very well are songbirds. So these are zebra finches. And they sing. And I won't play you their song here, but this is the spectrogram of a zebrafinch song. And not too different from speech, in which this is our frequency axis. This is, of course, time. And these are the syllables of the song. And they can sing this hundreds and hundreds of times pretty faithfully, where you could almost overlay each song on top of each other. When scientists record from neurons in an area of the zebrafinch brain, they can record from many different neurons. So here they're recording from 136 neurons. And here we're just showing the activity when those neurons spike and aligning them in time. And so some neurons spike early on, some neurons spike later, and so forth. So you have sort of this chain of activity in which seems to be the brain's clock, for the song at least. So some neurons telling, okay, it's the beginning of the song, middle of the song, and so forth. So you have these complex patterns, neural dynamics. Now, in a more complex network, and this is a simulation here, and normally I wouldn't show this simulation, but here, because I'm at Google and there's a strong interest in AI and machine learning, I'll give you an example of a simulation of a recurrent neural network in which you're simulating neurons, and these neurons are connected to each other. And actually, Kirill, I'm going to I forgot there's one more button I'm going to have to ask Google to press in a minute. And when you do this, this network is going to do a speech recognition task, a speech transcription task. So the network will listen to a spoken digit and then transcribe that pattern in time. So Google, can you still start that movie, please? So what you'll see here, I'll show a point over here. So that's the spectrogram. And this is the activity in the neural network. So this is the activity of different neurons. And this is driving that activity. And that activity here is driving. So there's not much hidden here. Unlike, say, a deep learning network, which drives a lot of series power, of course. This is the whole thing happening right here. This network is driving this and processing this stimulus. There's around 4,000 units in this. So in contrast to a deep network in which you have millions. So that was a fast 8, and the next 8 will be slower.
8.
So that was a slower 8. And the point here is that by encoding time in these trajectories, in the dynamics of these neural networks, it naturally solves the problem of what we call temporal invariance, the issue of how you can recognize a song or speech, whether it's spoken very quickly or very slowly. So overall, as far as we know, one of the major computational strategies the brain has to process time-varying information, which is most of the information you're processing right now, speech, of course, is through neural dynamics, is through changing patterns of activity. Now, we all know that whatever the clocks that are within our brain is sometimes they're inaccurate. So there's a mismatch between objective time and subjective time. And this leads to temporal illusions or temporal distortions everybody's familiar with time flies when you're having fun. And to go back to a quote from Henry James, which was from his magnum opus, Principles of Psychology, written over 100 years ago, he says, in general, a time filled with varied and interesting experiences seems short in passing, but long as we look back. On the other hand, attractive time, empty of experiences, seems long in passing, but in retrospect, short. So some people refer to this as the vacation paradox. You're having fun in Athens for the first day, and you're seeing a lot of new sights, meeting new people, and time seems to fly by prospectively. So as it's happening, as it's playing out, prospectively, your estimates of time are only a short amount of time has elapsed, even though it might have been a long period of time. But retrospectively, as you look back, that's not so much a timing task, but a memory task. You're thinking back of the number of items, or you're influenced by the number of items in memory. So if you have a full day in which a lot of interesting things were happening, you're going to have a lot of memories of that event and left with the impression that it was a long period of time elapsing. Now, in contrast, if you're bored or anxious, then as time is going by prospectively, you might overestimate the amount of time. It seems like a lot of time has been going by. So you're stuck at the airport, and you're on a 6-hour wait because of a plane delay, and time is dragging, right? You're bored out of your mind. Retrospectively, when you look back upon your trip, that's merely a blip in your conscious experiences, right? So because you know, the Atlanta bathroom is only so interesting, and it didn't store too much information about that wonderful experience in your memory banks. So we have this paradox between prospective timing and retrospective timing, which in part influences our ability to tell time. Now, everybody has also known about cases under sort of extreme danger or extreme stress situations in which people report time actually slowing down or things happening in slow motion. And so this is a report of a race car driver whose car was thrown into air, spun around in the air. He obviously survived, and later gives this report. It seemed like the whole thing took forever. Everything was in slow motion, and it seemed to me like I was a player on a stage and could see myself tumbling over and over in the car. It was as though I sat in the stands and saw it all happening. So here, obviously, it's not only their impression of the passage of time that is being altered, right? Space as well. I think this is probably best described as an hallucination. So this is an altered state in which our sense of time and sense of body, sense of space has been dramatically altered. So I think the mystery here is not so much what happens in these states, but what happens in the normal state that gives us our impression of the passage of time. Now, this ability to tell time and perceive the passage of time, estimate how much time has elapsed, is not unique to humans in any way. All animals, or most animals, certainly have the sense of the time of day. They know they have a circadian clock. They can learn when food will arrive, and so forth. What is unique in humans, however, is probably our ability to engage in what we call mental time travel. So we can think about the past and relive our memories and re-experience things that we have already experienced, and sort of study that, right? We can learn, we can reimagine a conversation we had, we can give it alternate endings to test out whether we should have said something different or not. But even more importantly, we can imagine the future. We can project ourselves into the future and simulate the future in our heads. And some people believe that this is indeed why consciousness evolved. So the consciousness is a way to simulate the future. And this is what makes humans humans, right? Whether it's your ability to, the first person to carve a knife or a weapon out of an obsidian stone must have had something in mind. What am I going to use this for? So this ability to think about what this will be used for in the future seems to evade the ability of most animals. So you take one of the most important inventions of humankind, agriculture, right? It's a hard concept that we take for granted, right? I'm going to plant something now and reap its benefits that are going to guarantee survival a year from now. This ability to link cause and effect actions across large delta T's, long periods of time, is very unique to humans. I've always wondered if humans are the only species that have figured out the relationship between sex and pregnancy, right? That's a fairly long period of time. Can other animals grasp that relationship? Because it spans periods of weeks or months. Now, looking into the future can be a bummer, right? Because the first humans to really see the future and grasp saw something they probably didn't like, right? And this might have been, by the way, a good time to invent religion, when you first started understanding what the future holds. And I think this point is beautifully made by Jorge Luis Borges. To be immortal is commonplace, except for man, all creatures are immortal, for they are ignorant of death. So certainly seeing into the long-term future is what characterizes our species in many ways. But it also has affect our culture in many ways and how we cope with what we see. Now, just because humans are uniquely able, and I'm sorry, there's going to be one more button I'm going to need pressed over there for the next movie. I didn't look far enough into the future to anticipate this, sorry. Just because human beings are uniquely able to engage in mental time travel doesn't mean we're actually particularly good at it, right? And so learning to delay gratification and learning to withhold immediate rewards for longer-term benefits is something our species is uniquely able to do, but it's also something we struggle with. So here's the gratuitous cute baby video of the talk. You can start that, please. And this is the famous marshmallow experiment. Will that play? Doesn't look like it's going to play here. We're probably OK. Just probably pressing enter or something there. That's okay. We'll do without it. We'll do without the gratuitous video of kids eating marshmallows. So the marshmallow experiment, as many of you probably know, is an experiment in which they say they get 4 or 5-year-olds and say, okay, here's one marshmallow. You can eat it now, or you can wait until I come back, and then you're going to get 2 marshmallows. And this ability to delay gratification is indeed part of what it means to grow up, to be able to withhold your immediate gratification for a later reward. And these studies later showed, these studies by Walter Mischel at Stanford, that started in the 70s, and he later tracked down many of these children. And he found a correlation, a weak correlation, but a correlation nevertheless, with their ability to withhold, to wait, to withhold gratification at the young age with later SAT scores. So there's many pieces of evidence that there's a correlation between what we call temporal discounting, or ability to postpone, or patience with health issues as well. So the major issue there, of course, is that much of what we do is contingent upon our understanding that what we do now has consequences in the future. And going to school, saving for retirement, exercising are all things that we take for granted but are implicitly contingent on our understanding of temporal relationships, right? Of long-term temporal relationships. But many of the problems we face as individuals and as members of society arise from not doing that well enough, temporal myopia. So personal credit card debt, exercising, eating healthy, not saving enough for retirement are things at the individual level which we struggle with in order to balance our short-term gratification with long-term rewards. At the more, at the sort of societal levels, failure to address climate change, underfunded pension plans, national debt are things that at societal level emerge in part because of our failure to take appropriate actions in the present to assure or guarantee a better quality of life or health in the future. Now, humans, as I said, are uniquely able to think about the long-term future. So how did that come about? What's unique about the human brain that gives us the ability to understand the fundamental difference between the past, present, and future, and to plan for months, years, or even decades ahead? So some people have argued that we do that in part because of our ability to talk and language, and because and use language, and our brain's ability to co-opt the parts of the brain that are used to understand space. So the idea is that there's areas in the brains of most mammals that allow them to navigate and understand space in a manner of speaking. And maybe the human brain co-opted those same structures to allow us to understand time. And one argument in favor of this is that a lot of the ways we talk about time is by using spatial metaphors. So I might say, it was a long day, or I'm looking forward to the eclipse, or you're thinking, I hope this talk ends shortly. So we're using spatial metaphors to talk about time. And this idea of the spatialization of time is really one of the main ways we talk and discuss and understand time. And another way to exemplify this is with what we call the Wednesday question. So I'll say, our Wednesday meeting was moved forward 2 days. What day is our meeting on? On Monday or Friday? So there's no right or wrong answer there, but it does reflect 2 different perspectives we have about time. So if you view time as sort of fixed and you're the one walking through time and you're moving, then you'd say you move something forward, and from Wednesday it might go to Friday. That's sort of what we call an ego-moving perspective. But if we have a time-moving perspective, you're probably in the Monday group. in which you're static, and like a river flowing, time is like a river flowing towards you, and that then the meeting would be on Monday. So there's these two different perspectives that people have about time, and they just reflect the ambiguity of language and the fact that we spatialize time within our brains. Now, this idea of the spatialization of time, that time is laid out in space, is very deep in the philosophical literature as well as in physics, because there's sort of two diverging theories as to the true nature of time. One is precisely this, that time is a dimension much like space. So this is called eternalism. And eternalism, under eternalism, the past, the present, and the future are all equally real. Now is perfectly arbitrary. Now is as arbitrary as here. Just like here is a perfectly valid point in space to be, I'm perfectly fine with you being over there. In time, now is arbitrary, and I should be perfectly fine. In eternalism, time is now is perfectly arbitrary, and other versions of me or other versions of you, if you will, are at past moments or present moments. So everything is equally real. And under presentism, in contrast, and this is sort of the more intuitive sense we have, in that only the present is real. So the past was real, some configuration of the universe that we call past and now exists only in our memories is real, was real. The present is real, and the future, some configuration of the universe at some future point, will become real based on what's happening in the present. So, of course, eternalism sort of justifies a talk or a debate about whether time travel is possible. It has nothing to do with the physics of time travel, whether you can actually do it or not, but eternalism justifies the debate because at least there's moments in time that exist that you could potentially try to travel to. Under presentism, the talk of time travel is a moot point because there's nowhere to go, or there's no when to go, to be more precise. Now, eternalism is sort of, to the degree that there is a standard view in physics, is the standard view. And this is in part because of Einstein's theory of special relativity. So let me just try to convey, I find presentism to be much more intuitive. I think it's more consistent with our experience. But we believe in eternalism, at least in the physical sense, for very good reasons. So let me try to convey those reasons, or one of those reasons. So to do this, let me go over a thought experiment, an Einsteinian thought experiment, in which we have the following setup. We have an observer on a stationary platform and a train going by at a ludicrously, impossibly fast speed of 2/3 the speed of light, 0.67 times the speed of light. There's an individual in the middle of the train that's shooting these space-age bullets towards the front and the back of the train. Now, if you're this individual, it doesn't matter, because of the laws of physics and relativity, that you're moving or not. So you're going to shoot the bullet forward and shoot the bullet backwards. And those bullets have to travel the same distance at the same speed, so this pane of glass will break at the same time as that pane of glass. Now, okay, so this person should observe that pane of glass breaking at the same time as this person glass. Now here, you're the observer, and you're going to see the train traveling at a high speed. You're going to see this bullet traveling in the opposite direction at the same speed, so this bullet will have speed 0, will have velocity 0. So basically, this bullet will be going, will be standing in midair as the back of the train runs into the bullet. Okay, now that's pretty straightforward. Now, this forward bullet should be going at the speed of the bullet plus the speed of the train. Now, the speed of the bullet is 2/3 the speed of light. The speed of the train is 2/3 the speed of light. So the sum of those is 1.3 times the speed of light. Okay? That's a no-no, right? We can't go faster than the speed of light. That's what Einstein told us. So there's something goofy that's going to happen here. This bullet can't be traveling as fast as it needs to be going to break this pane of glass at the same time. So we see the bullet in motion, approaching the panes of glass, and the person on the train will observe both panes breaking at the same time. They'll be breaking simultaneously. But the person on the stationary platform will not see that happen. And it has nothing to do with delays or the time it takes information to get from here to there, okay? This is just based on all those adjustments and delays being taken into account. So this person will observe a different reality. While this person has a reality in which both panes of glass break at the same time, for this person's reality, there will be a moment in time where this is broken, but that is not. So this is taken as an argument. This lack of absolute simultaneity is taken as an argument for the block universe or for eternalism. So why is that? So let me give it again, run that through you with this example here. So let's look at this sort of our mini block universe with 4 dimensions, but we're going to only plot 2. Instead of the 3 spatial dimensions, we only have 1, and we have this temporal dimension. So for the person on the train, this is their plane of simultaneity. There's a moment where both panes of glass at the back of the train and at the front of the train are both intact. There's another moment, in exactly the same moment, where both panes of glass break. Then there'll be another moment in time where both panes of glass are already broken. So these are the planes of simultaneity for the person on the train. Now the person on the platform, in reality the person on the platform is, in our analogy, not moving, which is the same thing as from the perspective of the person on the train. The person on the platform is moving in the opposite direction. So just for reasons here, this is going to be a bit easier to explain that way. So the person on the platform is sort of traveling in the opposite direction of the person on the train. Now, these planes of simultaneity don't match up for the person on the platform. So the plane of simultaneity, special relativity, Einstein's theory of special relativity, tells us that these moments will be the same on these person's clock. So there'll be a moment where the front pane is not broken and the back one is. So the point is that it's as if the universe, everything that can happen, has already happened. And the reason some things appear simultaneous for one person and not for another is a question of perspective. So here the idea is from this person's perspective, these events are aligned, but not for this person. So this is one of the arguments for eternalism or the block universe. Now, there's a clash here, right? If this is true, it sort of leaves our impression of the flow of time as an illusion, because if everything has already happened, the clear subjective feeling that time is flowing would seem that it has to be an illusion in a certain sense. And physicists have long been aware of this. So this is a quote from Roger Penrose. It seems to me that there's a severe discrepancy, or there's severe discrepancies between what we consciously feel concerning the flow of time and what our theories assert about the reality of the physical world. It's another good quote by Hermann Weyl, a physicist from the mid-1900s. The objective world simply is. It does not happen. Only to the gaze of my consciousness crawling upward along the world line of my body does the section of the world come to life as a fleeting image in space, which continuously changes in time. So they're getting to this issue that the flow of time must be an illusion. So this severely clashes with the neuroscience of time, in which it clearly feels that the subjective experience of time is flowing by. Now, the question is if this is consistent with our experience of consciousness. Now, we don't really know what consciousness is, so this is a very difficult question to address. But consciousness probably isn't what it seems to be, in the sense that it seems to be providing a linear narrative of what's happening in the world around us. Rather, the unconscious mind seems to be creating this narrative in chunks and then feeding this into the conscious mind, or creating the conscious mind, if you will, to create a convenient an apparent flow of what's happening. So there's a couple of illusions that show this. It's a bit of a hard concept to explain, but let me just try to give you a quick example here. I'm going to say two sentences, and just pay attention to the meaning of the sentences. So the first sentence is, the mouse pad was beside the computer. The second sentence, the mouse was hungry. So in both those sentences, the meaning of the word mouse was very different, right? So I think you're able to understand that in the first case, the mouse referred to an object, the computer pad, mouse pad, and the second, to a rodent. But the meaning of mouse could only be determined by the words that came after. You cannot possibly interpret that sentence in real time. The mouse pad or the mouse was hungry. So what comes after has to influence your interpretation of what came before. So this is one of the lines of evidence that suggests that our conscious experience is not so much a continuous linear flow of the world around us, but of a creation that is generated in sort of fits and bursts of the interpretation of what's happening around us. So it may be the case that our understanding of consciousness may or may not be compatible with the standard view in physics. I think Steven Pinker was hinting at this when he stated, matter is extended in space, but consciousness exists in time as surely as it proceeds from I think to I am. So we have to decide, and I think physicists and neuroscientists have to collaborate more to decide if we should view our subjective sense of the passage of time as an empirical observation about the universe, one that has to be explained by physics, or if it's an illusion in the deepest sense of the world, and thus one that doesn't have to be explained by physics, but then has to be explained by neuroscience. How does the brain generate the conscious subjective feeling of something that has no correlate in the physical world, that is, of the flow of time? Now, to address these questions, I think we have a long way to go. And neuroscience is a very unique field. Neuroscience is a unique field in all of sciences because neuroscience is the only field in which the organ or the thing being studied is also doing the studying. And this raises a couple of potential concerns, right? Not least of which, well, is that even possible? Can something understand itself? It's, of course, way too early to answer that question. But as scientific fields evolve, as they mature, part of that maturation process is to progressively embrace time. You look at what I would consider the first field of modern science, geometry. Geometry was formalized by Euclid 2,300 years ago. It was highly influential and transformative. But why was it the first field of science? Well, it was the first field of science because science is easier if you can ignore time. That's what geometry is, right? Geometry is the study of space and objects that don't change in time. It was only around 2,000 years after Euclid when people such as Galileo and Newton came along and fully integrated time and dynamics into physics. Same thing in biology. You think about biology up in the 1700s, most of the 1800s, it was largely taxonomic and fairly static. And then Darwin, playing the role of Galileo, said, hey, species are dynamic. They change, they adapt, they evolve in time. I think neuroscience is only reaching this renaissance now where it's fully beginning to embrace time and realize that the brain is, in a sense, a temporal organ. It's a time machine, if you will. It tells time. It remembers the past to predict the future. It allows us to mentally time travel and creates the subjective sense of the flow of time. So elucidating how the brain tells time, represents, and conceptualizes time is critical to understanding the human mind and the nature of consciousness. Thank you very much.
We have 3 minutes for questions.
Hi, I have 2 questions over here. Yeah, first question is about your claim that humans are unique in the sense that we can foresee in the future. But there has been a lot of studies in animals, like especially monkeys, where they can plan for the day, what they're gonna do. That they wake up early in the morning and they go and get some fix. If they don't go for the fix, they will just wake later.
Yep.
So
So-
it's kind of a weak argument what you just made.
I
In what
think-
sense do you?
I think so. It's called mental time travel, and the debate about whether other animals can engage in mental time travel is an active one. There's no debate about is the extent to which humans can engage in mental time travel. So no other animal can talk about plans 5 years in the future because no other animals can conceive or can communicate about that. But interestingly, the best animal data on the possibility of mental time travel in animals is not from monkeys. So the monkeys' data is fairly debated. The major test people use there is if monkeys can learn to use money. Because money is something that implicitly requires, this has no value. This has no value, right? Paper has no value. It only has value because I assume that in the future I can exchange it for something better. So they try to teach monkeys, apes, great apes, to use money by changing for tokens. And they can sort of get it to hang, but this is highly debated. So that data is still controversial. But the best data actually comes from birds. And there's corvids, scrub jays, that the best argument comes from. They can seem to, if they're always exposed to one part of their aviarium in the morning and one part in the afternoon, they seem that they can plan ahead by putting the food in the part of the morning aviarium and not in the afternoon aviarium. So this is an active field of debate, but part of the debate is just one of extent, and humans clearly can cross years and centuries that other animals can't.
Okay.
Yep.
Another question is like you were mentioning this kind of view between the dichotomy between the physical explanation of subjective explanation of where we stand with time as we move forward. But there is like a physical sense where you can put like an arrow of time, and there is all these things about entropy, like irreversibility. So there is like an objective physical sense that you can say that there is a time that moves forward. That is not kind of an.
So in the block universe, everything is already laid out. But there's still an arrow of time because there's a forward arrow in which things go one way and not the other way. As you probably know, the laws of physics are time asymmetric. You can run Newton's equations or Einstein's equations or even Schrodinger's equation forwards or backwards. There's no time. So the typical explanation to address the arrow of time is, as you brought up, the entropic arrow, that entropy increases. Now, entropy by itself doesn't explain the arrow. What it does is just say it provides an asymmetry. The real explanation comes from the fact that the universe seems to have started in a state of low entropy, and from there it can only go up. But the tricky thing about entropy is if I say there's a state of medium entropy here, that predicts that the next time step it should be higher. But if you think about it, it also predicts that the previous time step should be higher. So the entropic arrow is sometimes called a bidirectional arrow that doesn't explain the arrow of time by itself. It needs to be coupled with an assumption about a lower initial state.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, first of all, and I'm not saying this to impress anyone, but I'm an atheist. But when I look at the eternalism worldview, the block world, you know, we can look at a person as a baby and a person as an adult, and practically or all cells of their body have since died and been replaced. They are, and that's a topic in itself, like what makes me me, like why do I feel like the same? But if I look at the block universe as you depicted it, and say, okay, space and time is all there is, and it all exists already, then it brings about a philosophical question of what links the slice where I was a baby and the slice where I'm an adult to create a consciousness that views both as the same thing, right? So it almost suggests an additional layer, no?
I don't know. I think the question of consciousness is perplexing either way. Whether what makes you you or makes me me and what consciousness is, I think that's a dilemma, a challenge to science, whether you're participating, whether you subscribe to the eternalist view or the presentist view, right? Consciousness, we can't explain either way. But I think there's a further challenge of posed by the eternalist view when it comes to consciousness in terms of if things aren't flowing, changing in a dynamic fashion, why do we have this clear, distinct feeling? And more importantly, what's the evolutionary function of feeling time change if there's no correlate with the actual universe? It's not like something we perceive color, right? Color is a creation of the human mind, right? Because there's no color in the physical world. There's wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. We interpret that as color, but that has a very strong adaptive value. So there's a correlation there. So the question is if we feel time flowing, but it actually doesn't, what's that function from an evolutionary perspective? And I think that's the mystery that we'll probably have for a while.
Hi, thanks for coming. So what's the difference between the mental time travel and like fantasy? Like telling myself a story about the future.
Yeah.
What I mean is, like, an example is I could tell myself a story that I will go to the store later and it will be open, but that might not be so. So is there like a probability element wrapped up in there, or?
I think the interesting question is could we even have stories if we couldn't have mental time travel? Can other animals have stories, and whether that story takes place in the future or the present or the past, right? Later on, I'm going to go to the museum. And so is that a story? Is that a plan? Or is that a fiction? So what makes humans unique, I believe, is that what makes us creative is this fine line between stories and reality. So if I'm primitive man and it's a story, I wish I could hunt down a mammoth. Is that a story? But then you're thinking, if I had a weapon, maybe I could. So this marriage of the stories and reality, I think, is probably what's driving much of our technology and creativity, is this very delicate balance between getting the stories just so that it sounds like fiction, but it's fiction we can create in the future.
Sure, yeah, I would just say we're almost always wrong.
Absolutely.
Until we've seen a repeatable path, if that makes sense. So.
I certainly feel that I'm almost always wrong. I assume some people are often right. But there's trial and error and stochasticity in there, absolutely. And we can't know in advance. So if the future has been laid out, clearly we don't have access to it.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome.
Hello. Thanks so much for this. Is great.
Thank you.
Are you familiar with Donald Hoffman?
No.
He's like a physicist, philosopher. He's got interesting theories about consciousness. And the fact, I'm probably going to butcher his theory, but I think essentially it's that consciousness is the base of reality and everything else is layered on top of it. So he claims to have proven that, everything we know, everything we see is just based on, is just something we constructed because it was evolutionarily adaptable. It was a good thing for us. Do you think time could be something similar to that?
So there's this very interesting debate about whether time. So some fields or hypotheses in physics are trying to get rid of time. So say that time doesn't exist. And what this means is that time is not a property. They're not saying that clock time doesn't exist. What they're saying is that time isn't a fundamental property of the universe. It's not like energy or matter. And that time is simply an abstraction, a creation of the human mind. The way Ernst Mach put this is it's utterly impossible to measure change by time because time is an abstraction at which we arrive at by measuring change. And that's indeed what clocks do. All clocks are just some device that conveniently standardizes change, whether that change is the swing of a pendulum or quartz crystal. So the subjective feeling of time, I think I've sort of already expressed, it's unknown. But the concept of time, I think I do like the idea that it's an abstraction that we've created that's incredibly useful to help us understand the universe and make sense of the world, but it's not a fundamental property of physics.
Thank you.
Thanks for this talk, by the way. I had some questions about your thoughts on how our relative conceptions of time are limited by physical, like dendrites, axons, physical barriers. So in a world where we are able to create artificial intelligence or even potentially upload our own consciousness or replicate our consciousness in a world which isn't limited by dendrites and axons, what are your thoughts on being able to extend our concepts of time because of those physical barriers being removed? Or slowing down time. So a real person is existing. There's an AI which experiences 1,000 years of time because they're able to process information faster.
There's a couple of issues there. So those are deep questions. I mean, one is the hardware question, right? Is consciousness and our subjective experience of time hardware dependent, hardware limited? Can you create AIs that have consciousness totally equivalent to ours? So that's a question that, of course, nobody knows the answer to. I mean, as a materialist, I certainly believe there's no reason that consciousness has to be hardware limited. Now, that question, however, is different from the question of speed of processing, right? So this question of sampling rate, in which the speed of processing is ultimately independent of the notion of the passage of time. You're processing signals that coming from my speech that you're doing that right now that are far beyond your subjective experience of the passage of time. So the brain clearly processes things that are happening very quickly, like this. That's microseconds. Your brain detects that. So even though they're made of neurons, it's an incredible feat, right? Neurons have a time constant of maybe an action potential. So if you were going to give it a computer clock rate, you'd probably give it a kilohertz instead of a couple of hundred gigahertz, for example. So then, so that time level of processing is different from the time level of subjective experiences. Now, nobody knows the answer to the question of whether an AI would be able to have these temporal distortions of conscious experiences like you or I have. But I think there's, in a way, it's a wrong question. I think the mystery is not so much how time comes to be distorted, how in extreme cases of time dilation or time compression, but what our normal sense of time is. And I view this as just a flexibility of consciousness. You can be conscious of a short period of time or a long period of time. That's just a conscious state. It's just a flavor of consciousness, just like pain or pleasure or color. So I think that when we understand the nature of consciousness, the question of whether it seems long or short will be sort of a minor issue along those lines, because I think what we perceive is a bit arbitrary.
Just a quick note, we're a bit over 2 p.m., so let's not add more questions. If you're already in line, ask your questions. But
Okay, thank you here. I want to ask about what is the difference, or are they the same thing for the things like retrospective thinking and the autobiographic memory, or like the retrospective thinking is about general loss of memory, or just things about myself in the past?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So autobiographical memory or episodic memory is about events in our own life, and that's tightly coupled to how we retrospectively perceive time. So if there's a period of time in which you have a rich autobiographical memory, I did this, and this, that's likely to elicit a long estimate of time. Whereas if you don't have any events in memory, that's a short period of time. The extreme example of this is somebody who has amnesia. So you can imagine if somebody has no ability to form new episodic memories or autobiographical memories, how could they even estimate the amount of time has elapsed? So there's this very touching, poignant case of a British man called Clive Waring, and maybe some of you have seen specials on him, but he has terrible anterograde amnesia, and he seems to be locked into the present. There's a story where he's writing in his diary, 9 a.m., I just woke up. 9:30, now I'm awake for the first time. 10 o'clock, now I'm really awake for the first time, right? Because if you don't have that memory, how can you know how much time has elapsed? So clearly, retrospectively, time and memory are tightly coupled.
Hi. So as you said, all of our timekeeping devices rely on oscillators or rely on some kind of notion of periodicity. And so kind of I guess my question is like, if you look at an oscillation or a sine wave or any sort of any sort of phenomenon that you can understand that way, there's a notion of symmetry that's really important. That you could be at one point in this oscillation, or you can be at the exact same point in another period later, and so it gives you kind of that eternal perspective. What if that didn't exist? So like, how would we measure time if we didn't have this sort of repeatable?
You mean man-made time, right? Clock time. You mean?
Well, I guess what I'm asking is like, is there something fundamental about the idea of like periodicity or?
No, I don't.
Well, I'm just like, how would we measure
So
time if there wasn't something that was symmetric, that we could always kind of start back?
So no, I don't think so. I think it's just reproducibly. I mean, you can measure time by an hourglass is something doesn't have to be periodic. So I think man-made clocks rely on this mechanism because it's an incredibly useful symmetric one, right? And it's the best way to do something continuously is with something that's periodic. But you need some sophisticated counter, and that was really the main problem. But even if you look at something like planetary motion, right? You can tell the time of year by looking at the positions of the planets.
So
but
even with an hourglass, you could turn it over. Like there's
you can, but you
don't
have to. You can, but you don't have to, right? You could have a non-periodic hourglass. So I think periodicity is something that, in our minds, because of the success of man-made clocks, is something we naturally think of as an ideal way to tell time, and it probably is. But interestingly, I think there's a downside to that, which is people spent a bit too much time looking for those oscillators and counters in the brain. And I think that threw the field off a bit, because that's probably not how the brain tells time. Yes, the brain has oscillators, but it doesn't seem to have many oscillator counter systems. So I think these metaphors we use in the external world sometimes can put us back a bit when we're overly influenced by them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks, Dean.
Thank you.